Well, good morning and welcome to a budget PC build. The main reason I'm looking to do this is I'm looking for a new streaming machine. This thing should also double pretty well as a 60 frames 1080p gaming rig, and it should do actually pretty much anything pretty well. You're going to find a lot of videos out there just kind of like this one. You're going to find a lot of similarities in the hardware, a lot of similarities in the choices and decisions. However, by accepting a used graphics card, which is something I think pretty much everyone in this price bracket is willing to do, you can build a much better computer for about $100 less, including tax, than the next cheapest one of these builds I've seen online. Hey buddy. This is Modi. He's helping me out today. So what am I choosing for hardware? Well, I've actually got a list, so let me hop over to my main computer here. So here's what we ended up with, and I will drop a link to this spreadsheet, at least in a viewable form, in the description, because I have a few different build types here that we're considering. The one I'm doing for the YouTube build here, we are running a Masterbox Q300L case. You should be able to get this for $39.99 shipped plus tax without any issue. During the Christmas season, it's been a little hard to get your hands on, but $46 including tax. For the boot drive, I'm going to be running an ADATA SU650, which I'll show you in just a second. It's a SATA 2.5-inch 6 gigabit per second SSD. That's going to run our Windows as well as our games and OBS and the recordings that come out of it. The drive's not very big, but again, most games you're going to be playing actually aren't that bad. So if you're only playing a couple of titles, it's going to give you plenty of headroom to do other things with the machine. For the processor, I'm using AMD's Ryzen-3 2200G. It's the best bang for the buck processor out there. This is actually an APU, which means it has an integrated graphics controller in it. It's actually right over here. And it's a very, very impressive piece of hardware. I'm actually going to do a few tests with the APU before I put in the graphics card, which I chose, which is right behind it there. For the motherboard, I chose a Gigabyte AB350M. I also have a 320 chipset motherboard here, as well as an AMD A-series processor, which I actually bought to flash the BIOS on these motherboards, which I'll go over in a few minutes as well. And I'm going to do some testing on that to see if you can get by with a processor that's half as expensive to save some money and maybe get a better GPU or some better RAM. For a cooler, I'm running the bundled Wraith Stealth, which is a really, really nice unit that comes with the Ryzen 3. For the power supply, I put in a placeholder and actually bought one of these to show you, so I'll use it for this build. Is the Antec VP450, and that's $19 refurbished, $26 after shipping and tax. For RAM, I'm not skimping out. I'm not using cheap RAM. I'm not using 8 gigs like everyone else's build. I'm using G.Skill 16 gigabyte Aegis series memory at 3000 megahertz, and that's DDR4. Ryzen loves fast RAM. This is going to make a big difference. I did also buy a Ripjaw 8 gigabyte 2400 megahertz kit, so we can do some testing there to see just how much you do gain from using 16 gigs and faster RAM. And then for the graphics card, I went used. The RX570 right now, after the crypto mining tank, basically with all the difficulty, people are parting out their rigs left and right. These cards were very, very, very popular with crypto miners. So you can pick one of these things up easily, a nice one, low hours, well taken care of, for $75. And that's what I've done. This is a MSI Armor RX570 with a nice big twin fan, no frills, no RGB, but a really nice cooling package. And these things just kick ass as far as performance goes. Especially for a mid-range card. 1080p 60 frames on high settings, or ultra even in a lot of cases, no problem. 1440p on medium high, no problem. So that's what I chose for the GPU, and I think that's what really keeps the budget down and the performance high here. It allows you to run 16 gigabytes of RAM. It allows you to, if you're not counting tax, enough room to get a 1 terabyte hard drive in there, or switch over to something like this, which is a 256 gigabyte NVMe SSD, which is about twice as fast as the SATA version. Really not something you're going to notice. day to day, but for transfers and video editing and things like that, it's really nice, especially if you are running 8 gigabytes instead of 16. So the motherboard back here is the one I was telling you about earlier. This is the 320 chipset. This is perfectly fine for any Ryzen processor through 2020. However, I'm not going to use it because it doesn't support overclocking. I paid $42 for this board. It was refurbished, and that's the cheapest Ryzen motherboard I could find. Still has an NVMe slot, still has enough SATA, but only a 4-pin EPS for overclocking. So, I mean, it doesn't support overclocking anyway. It really doesn't need more than that. But it's got, nice high-grade capacitors everywhere except for the sound circuitry down here, which isn't really crucial to the motherboard. Yeah, the one we're going to be actually using for the build is right there, which I'll pull out in just a second. I also wanted to show you this guy. So when you buy an earlier Ryzen motherboard and a later Ryzen processor, like this, 2nd gen processor, you're going to have probably some issues with the BIOS, which is why you're probably going to find your motherboard open box or used, because somebody bought it, didn't know what was going on. It requires a BIOS flash. AMD, if you contact them and you've purchased a Ryzen processor, will send you something called a boot kit. And what that is it's one of these A-series processors. It's actually a dual-core version. This is a quad-core. They will send it to you for free. You can use it to flash your BIOS, and then you send back just the processor and a prepaid label and enclosure. You keep the cooler. They don't want it. The cooler on this they call a silent thermal solution. It is not a Wraith Stealth like you get with the Ryzen, which is much superior. But these are actually pretty solid little cooling units in here. And I actually paid brand new $46 plus tax at Microcenter for this thing. So I just did that to avoid the slowdown of the build with the boot kit. And because I honestly think this might be a viable alternative to the Ryzen 3 2200G since we're not using the integrated graphics. This does have Radeon R7 graphics, but I think they're clocked at 900 megahertz, and it's about half the graphics cores of the Ryzen 3 APU. And I'm also going to be overclocking that, hopefully, a little bit to get a little more performance out of the APU before we jam in that RX570, which should blow it out of the water. But first things first. On all of the build variants, I chose this Cooler Master Master Box, which is a budget sub-brand, Q300L. The reason why I chose this, excellent airflow. It's got a window on the side, and it was pretty cheap, $40. So I think it actually looks pretty good too. My advice to you would be, if you're building one of these, don't put it in an environment where you have to touch it, because it's really, really lightweight and it actually feels really chintzy, but it looks like it's got a nice deep bay on the other side for cable management. It's got nice USB 3 I/O on the front, which is actually the side, as well as obviously front audio, power and reset. But I'll open this thing up and I'll show you what we got going on inside. So here we have inside of the Q300L, and you can see the very deep cable management tray. It's more than my first knuckle deep, which should allow a much cleaner looking build. A bundled 120 millimeter fan, which actually looks pretty solid. Room for a ton more fans. It has dust filtration top, bottom, and front, which is a really nice thing to see on a case of this price point. And it actually comes with a bunch of things as well. So new grommets for the side window, a lot of screws, zip ties for cable management, and of course, tasty silica gel, which I don't recommend you eat. The one thing I really wish case manufacturers would get down a little bit better is the USB 3.0 headers. These plugs are unnecessarily thick and chunky. I know they need shielding for the speed level, but this is really kind of tacky. It's really hard to cable manage something like this. So this chassis, I think is going to be a great fit for this build. These are just magnetic dust filters, which we'll probably pull off for the build and then put back on when we're done. But yeah, the other side of the chassis comes off with screws instead of thumb screws. Oh, sorry guys. But still pretty nice looking. It's black through and through. And again, the pre-installed fan is a really nice touch. It's actually a Cooler Master branded fan. So I lament the fact a little bit that it doesn't have an optical drive bay, but no case these days really does. So I'm gonna get this thing out of the way and we'll take a look at that motherboard. So here we have our AB350M Gaming 3 motherboard, B350 chipset, which is pretty much the cheapest you can get for the Ryzen series processors that supports overclocking. And as you can see, I paid a whopping $48.96 plus tax for this board at Microcenter. The only thing it was missing is a little silly, but it's missing the rear I/O shield. Not necessarily a crucial component for a PC build, so I'm not too concerned about it. However, that's something I'm probably going to try to find in the future. So, got our driver disk, SATA cables, and of course the board itself. So here's our board. You're going to see a few things straight away that make it look much, much better than the 320 series. The first one is going to be, you've actually got VRM heatsinks. That's really, really nice to see. You've also got an 8-pin EPS, which signifies that it is ready for some overclocking. A little bit more I/O on the back, including USB 3, as well as a header on the front for USB 3, of course. The 320 board has all of that as well. But here we're going to find dual channel DDR4 support with 4 slots for dual inline memory modules, whereas this is 2. However, I believe that does still have dual channel, even though it's 1 slot per bank, versus this having 2 slots per bank. Of course, we see an NVMe slot. We see 2 PCIe X16 lanes, which is super nice, instead of just the 1. So if you want to go with Crossfire for your graphics cards, which that's what I run in my main rig, actually. With my Threadripper, I run 2 RX570. They're actually those MSI Gaming X cards, again, from an X mining rig, because they were $100 a piece. You're also going to see a little bit higher quality heat sinking on the North Bridge. This thing is actually a really, really solid motherboard, so I'm excited to use this for our build. I will, at some point, test out the 320 in comparison with the AMD A series anyway. I probably won't test it with the Ryzen just because when I first assemble this, I'm going to be installing that A8 processor. And then I'm going to update the BIOS, even if it doesn't necessarily need it, just to show you through the process, because it's very, very likely if you buy a board in the 3 series, the 300 series chipsets, you will have to do it. I will include links to a similarly priced B450 board, which you absolutely will not have to flash, so you can just go straight into it with your Ryzen 3 2200, or even a 2600 if you want to spend just a little tiny bit more and get some more performance. But yeah, this is what I'm going to be going with just because it supports everything that I'm looking for in this build. Well, here we have our no-frills power supply. This is actually how I got it from the reseller. This is claimed as a refurbished unit. I'm guessing it's a used one that they just call, you know, seller refurbished or something, but it still has an Antec warranty void sticker, which interestingly enough, those are against the law now, which is pretty cool. But it's got a little damage here. I'm guessing it'll be fine. But here we have the actual output, and the reason why I chose this was A, it's really cheap, B, it has an 8-pin EPS and a 6-pin PCIe, and of course a 24-pin for our motherboard, but actually has pretty solid outputs. The 12-volt rail's a little bit weak, but for, you know, this package, I think that's a 65-watt TDP with that CPU and that graphics card. In the packaging only says it needs a 450 watt, so we'll see. It should be able to handle even light overclocking on this system. Alternatively, if you're willing to go used, again, you could do something like this, which is a Corsair CX750M, which I bought for $25 used. That's really, really easy to find. A big chunky power supply like that that's even modular, at least semi-modular, for that kind of money. So, coming back to the case, we have some standoffs pre-installed, but we have some that still need to be installed. So, looks like only 2 are pre-installed. So, we'll have to go back to our hardware here, and it looks like they did include a decent number of standoffs for us. And once I get those standoffs in place, congruent with our motherboard, I'm actually going to steal the backing plate, which I've already done, for the CPU cooler off of that board, because in addition to missing, hey Modi, in addition to missing the I/O shield, it's also missing that little bracket on the back. So I've ordered one from China for like $6. It should have come with it even as an open box. So I'm going to use that plate to mount our A-series processor. And then I'll get it far enough along where we can get it to post. We'll update the BIOS, and then we'll throw in the Ryzen. But I guess first things first, we really probably should just assemble it with that AMD A-series processor to see what kind of performance difference we're going to be looking at with the 2200G versus the A8 9600. And this thing is actually a pretty impressive unit. It's a quad-core, 3.4, 4-thread with integrated graphics processor, but it's a much larger process technology. I think these are 12 nanometer and this is 21 or something like that. So you will see a significant performance and power improvement with the Ryzen series chip, especially with the graphics performance if you are intending to use the APU. I'll also test the Radeon R7 graphics in there just to kind of see what we're looking at, and then get a data point for the RX570 as well, just to see how much better it is and see what might make the most sense for you to kind of cheap out on and then spend a little more on. So first things first is going to be popping in those standoffs, and then I'll get that plate mounted on our AB350. Then we'll get the power supply at least set in, which will involve pulling the rear panel, feeding all the cords behind, because we're still going to try to make it look nice. Our standoffs are installed, all 6 of them. There, and there. Next up is going to be de-rubber banding and installing our Antec VP450W, a basic power supply. Since this computer case does have dust filtration on the bottom, I'm going to install it fan facing down, so it actually pulls air in from the bottom and out through the back. In a computer like this, it's really not going to be making that much heat, but it's going to be close to the graphics card, so I do want it to have its own separate airflow to keep the power supply cool and to make sure everything's running hunky-dory. Now, the Q300L actually has a power supply shroud or bracket, so we take out 4 basic screws on the back, and we use the supplied screws to mount the power supply to this and then install the entire thing back into the chassis. I'm not exactly sure why they did that, but they did. I think it might be because of the beveled bottom bracket on the back of the case. It's a little strange, but either way, we'll work around it and we'll get this installed. So we have the power supply sitting in now. Next step would normally be install the I/O shield, which goes right back there. Of course, again, since we're using a open box motherboard that did not come with one, I won't be installing one. Again, you really ought to have one, but in this case, I just don't, so we're going to build without it. But now, I'm going to grab that board, I'm going to mount the cooler brackets on it for the AMD A-series, and then we're going to socket the CPU before we put the entire combination into the case. So, here we have the brackets mounted from our Asus Prime 320M onto our Gigabyte AB350M. Next step is going to be opening up our AMD A-series processor packaging and getting the AM4 CPU and the cooling unit out. After that, we'll be socketing our RAM and then inserting the entire thing into the chassis. So this is what you get in the package. This is what they call a near-silent thermal solution. Pre-applied silk-screened paste, which we'll use for this process because who cares? And here we have our AMD A8 9600 series AM4 APU, as well as a case sticker, which we won't be using. Next step will be to open this little blister pack here very carefully. The pins on the bottom are extremely fragile. They can be bent very easily. You also want to make sure that you are statically grounded. I recommend an ESD wristband if you have one. If not, just make sure you're always in contact with something metal in the chassis while you're handling the CPU. Or in this case, since it's not installed in the CPU yet, just keep a finger on one of the cages for the USB ports, and that should be sufficient. So step one on the board will be to lift the installation socket on the zero insertion force PGA socket, and then we will align the gold arrow of the CPU to the arrow in the corner of the socket. Gold arrow. The CPU should insert with zero insertion force. Should drop right in. Once you've confirmed that it's indeed level, you're done. Once that arm is down, the processor is secured. Then you can move on to installing the thermal solution. In this case, it clips on like the old AM2, AM3, AM3 Plus units, so we'll be using these brackets. When we later go to the Ryzen 2200G, you will see that these brackets are removed and we fasten the Wraith Stealth directly to the plate on the back side of the main board. When you install this basic cooler, hinge it on here first, tilt the cooler down on, being sure not to interfere with either of the plastic brackets. Make sure the lever is on the opposite side. Fit the lever over this plastic stump here, and then tighten by pushing it over here. You should not be able to move it after that. Next step will be locating the CPU fan header on your motherboard, which is usually the closest one to the CPU, and install your PWM fan controller. The cabling looks pretty icky here, but this is not our long-term processor, so if you were installing this, I would recommend zip tying around that and clipping the tail just to make it look a little bit nicer. But in this case, our CPU is socketed and done. So, next up, I am actually going to socket the 2400 megahertz Ripjaw RAM, which I picked up for I think $67 at Microcenter. So this is one of the cheapest decent DDR4 kits I could find that actually looked like it might work okay with the Ryzen. 2400 is pretty slow for the Ryzen series processors, but this is an A8, which is less picky about RAM. So I'm just gonna unpack this from the blister pack, and then we'll get the DIMM slots opened up. And yeah, should be good to go to socket the RAM. So I went to the Gigabyte website since my board did not come with a manual, and it says if you have two modules, use DDR2 and DDR1, which are labeled on the motherboard. So we're going to use both red slots. It's very important you do this research, otherwise it's very unlikely that your random access memory will run in dual channel mode, and you will see significant performance hit. Now, the reason why I'm going with the 8GB kit right now is I want to start with probably the worst components I have here, and then slowly start swapping things back and forth to see what sort of performance gain we get from each component. I'm expecting the RAM to still be pretty good, but it's going to work the integrated graphics much harder. Generally speaking, you want more system memory if you're going to run an APU system, and you can get away potentially with 8GB if you're running a dedicated 4GB GPU like our Armor 570 RX. So, in order to socket the RAM, again, make sure you are statically grounded, and don't do what I do, just stacking things all around. I don't have that much room to work. Looking at the RAM, you will see that there is an off-center slot. So the bank of pins on the left is significantly shorter than the bank of pins on the right. And you'll also see that it's offset on the board toward us. So put the smaller section of pins toward us and sneak it in underneath the, I don't know what you call it, the fulcrum, I guess. Line it on the other end of the board and push until you hear a click. Do that for the other RAM DIMM as well. So at this point, we are ready to install this into our chassis. Again, normally you would have the I/O shield in the case already. We didn't get one. Dude, are you kidding me? You kitten me? You're such a loser. I love you, buddy. So yeah, let's just get ready to install this into the chassis. Now that we have the motherboard set where it needs to be, it looks so dorky without the I/O shield, but really it is functionally okay. The first thing I'm actually going to do is put the screws in, follow it up by connecting this fan from the case into our system fan header right up there. And then I will work on connecting the I/O, which includes the USB 3, front audio, and the switches and lights, to the headers on the motherboard. Most of them these days are labeled very, very well like this to make it really, really easy. And then after that, we'll start putting in the other components, and then we'll see if we can get this thing to boot up, get the BIOS flashed, get Windows on it, start running a few benchmarks, including a couple of games, just to see how it fares with the integrated Radeon graphics and this really, really budget CPU that, again, I only purchased to flash the BIOS on these motherboards, but actually it's a pretty impressive little thing. So we'll get all that tested, and then we will slot in 16 gigs of RAM, do the same tests with the APU, then we'll go back to 4, and then we'll put the graphics card in it, and then we'll do the tests again with 8 and 16 gigs of RAM at that point. I'm curious, I'm fascinated. I just don't get that many people out there showing the difference with really ultra budget components like this between, you know, the 8 and the 16 gigs of RAM for OBS and light gaming, things like that. So I'm mainly doing this as a curiosity for myself, but hopefully this is at least mildly enjoyable for you guys to watch as well. So I'm going to screw this motherboard down, get that fan connected, and we will keep going. So our board is in. Once you've got it in, before you screw it down, make sure all of your standoffs are in and opening, because I didn't have it right. I actually had it set up for this board, which is considerably smaller and runs a screw on the ITX level instead of the MATX level, like this board. So I had to pull the board back out, move that standoff, and reinsert it. After that, I installed the front audio header, the front USB 3.0 header, and all 4 of the front, I don't know what you call them, just the buttons and the lights. So there is a power LED. I'm not sure what's going to light up for that. Maybe there's a light inside of the switch, but we also hooked up the cache light and the reset and power switch. So all of these ports and buttons and lights are now functional. Next step is going to be feeding our 24-pin ATX power connector through the back, through probably this hole right here, and connecting it to the header, as well as our 8-pin EPS through the top, and then right over here past the VRM heatsink, and plugging that in as well. So we have those installed as cleanly as we possibly can. Next up, I'm going to be installing our 2.5-inch ADATA SU650 solid-state drive. So this case has room for some SSDs, and that is all going to be done basically on the back side, but we will be screwing through from this side. So in order to do that, you are going to need a pair of these. So you're going to sandwich, actually no, just one. So you'll pop those in the 2.5-inch section on this side, then you'll hold the drive on the back side. I've already pre-opened this just to save a little bit of faff. So there are screws in the back side, and you will use these isolator long screws here through the rubber grommet with your Phillips screwdriver to mount those. In this particular situation, I'm actually going to mount the SATA facing down just to try to keep it a little cleaner. They gave you these windows to run the cables through this way. I don't think that's going to look very good, so I'm going to not do that. And then we should have plenty of SATA power plugs on the back side of this PSU to run that. So this is your first time seeing the back. This is where we hide all of our sins. And something I probably should have mentioned first, you're going to want to plug in the SATA connections on this if you're going to mount it the stupid way like I did before you actually totally install it in here, because it's going to be really hard for you to fish the cable up underneath otherwise. And then also connect your SATA data cable, which your motherboard should have come with a bunch. Both, ooh, 90 degree even, very nice. Yeah, so make sure that that's cut power and signal, and then feed the SATA cable to the motherboard through whichever orifice is closest. And then once we got everything plugged in and we know that it works, we're going to come back through here with zip ties, and we're going to use all these included notches to zip tie our cables out of the way. This is where we hide all of our sins on the back side. This master box does have a very nice mounting plate for a 3.5-inch drive as well. You'll see one of the variants in the spreadsheet I'm going to dump in the links for you guys. A 1 terabyte hard drive that was like $19 shipped. I did actually buy that, but it's not here in time for the build, and it will put the Ryzen version with 16 gigs of RAM over the $400 limit, so I left it out. But I would highly recommend that, just so you can keep all your games installed at the same time, and so you have a drive to keep your OBS recordings on, because those get pretty big at 1080p 60. Well, unfortunately, there actually isn't enough space with this SATA connector here with power to run it the other way, so I put it the vertical way. In this case, it's actually set up where you could run the drive on the front side as well, and then hide the cables. So if you've got one of the fancy RGB ones or something, just put it on the inside and run the cables through the back. But this is nothing special to look at. It's not really a brag-worthy drive since it was $20 or less. So I'm just gonna leave it on the back side. And I think at this point we could put the back door back on the case, but I'm not gonna do that just because I do want to get this thing booted and posted before I try anything like that. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is what our build looks like right now. Pretty bare bones, but actually some pretty nice hardware. This is a totally decent chipset board. We have a totally respectable power supply, even though I'm not even sure if this is an 80% certified. It's probably 80% white, knowing Antec. I mean, they're not garbage. They do make some okay stuff. I don't know who actually makes this for Antec, or if they make it themselves. But the board has overclock ability, even though this is a locked CPU here, so we won't be able to overclock the AMD A series. Some really nice, but not terribly fast RAM, which we're going to try to probably overclock as well. The 2400 megahertz Ripjaw. And again, I've put links to all of this stuff as I'm able into the description. The Microcenter links are just, that's where you can get it cheaper if you've got one locally to you. All of the Amazon links, forewarning, are affiliate links. So we're just going to lay that out there. If you buy these components through those links, I do get a kickback. So just so you're aware, I don't care if you do or not, but people that, you know, shill and they don't say anything about it, it irks me. So just so you know, if you do buy a component through one of those links, I do get some money. So if you want to, awesome, I appreciate it. If not, who cares? It doesn't matter. So the RAM's good, board's good, CPU is underrated but very high quality. And the case itself, I'm actually really, really impressed with. The only things I don't really like for buildability is the screwdriver height for the standoffs over there. And right here, it's a little bit of a squeeze to get the screwdriver in there to tighten those down. The drive mounting's really, really good. The cable management is great. I think the choice for this PSU carrier is a little bit weird, but not bad. Overall, really, really nice case, especially for the money. I like it a lot. The last machine I built was in that Corsair 570X, and I think cable management's actually easier on this one because you can see through the glass panel on the back side of that one as well. And this one, you can hide all your sins. So I'm going to get this thing plugged in, and we're going to get Windows on it. And then I'll show you how to flash the BIOS. And then, yeah, we'll start swapping out some components and see what we can do with this thing. So I've got my mouse, keyboard, Ethernet, VGA, power, and my Windows 10 boot drive all hooked up to this thing. And here's the moment of truth. Oh my goodness, the board has RGB on it. Maybe it's just red lighting. That's kind of funny. Are we gonna get a post? Please? That's not good. Oh, it just took a second. We're good. Huh, I wonder what that was doing. That took a long time to get a post screen out of it. Wow, that rear case fan is running awful slow. Dude. Oh, don't sound so sad. Alright, I'm gonna install Windows 10 and get some stuff installed, and then I'll come back to this. Well, I gotta say, it actually doesn't look too bad in there, even with the completely base setting with the window on. I don't recommend taking the protective stuff off of your acrylic until it's fully done. I did it just because I want the thermals to be realistic when I'm doing the testing, so the dust filters are on, the window's on. Windows is almost installed. It actually went really, really fast with this USB 3.0 flash drive and the SSD, so CPU is still staying really, really cool. RAM is cool. Northbridge has a little bit of heat to it, but I don't anticipate that'll be an issue. And we'll get into overclocking too, but I do want to test it out with stock clocks on everything too. So we're in the process of downloading some stuff, but everything's recognized. We've got the AMD Radeon R7, which is pulling 512 megs of the DDR4, and we're showing all four physical and logical cores of the A8 9600. So I'm installing 3D Mark, VR Mark, PC Mark, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Fallout 4, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider demo. Those are, I think, pretty representative samples that should give us some good A/B. And then we'll also keep an eye on the memory usage to see if we're actually running into any issues with the 8 gigabytes of RAM before we step up to the 16. Right now I'm configuring Riva Tuner to try to figure out exactly how to get all of the data that we want on the screen during the captures, and I'm going to software capture everything with OBS, so that will probably take a significant hardware hit during game streaming. But it should test this thing out and stress it a fair bit. It's hard to believe this thing's running on $259 worth of hardware right now. That's already very impressive and usable. That's very, very fast for multitasking. The CPU's pretty impressive, so I'm thinking this combination with the 570 is going to actually be really, really respectable. And that's honestly, if you put this in a cheaper case with an RX570, a used one at that, you would be at $300, which is pretty much unbeatable for the kind of performance I bet we'll see out of it.